Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Human Influences. Vikings, Danes, Norsemen, whatever you want to call them, the mental image is the same. A biker gang in longboats and chainmail. Spurred on by a pantheon of gods that awaited them in Valhalla after a glorious death, history has painted the Vikings as seafaring psychopaths that would stop at nothing to burn crosses, enslave sweet Christian womenfolk, and kill more monks than the bad guys in the Planet of the Apes reboot. Reality, of course, is much less black and white. But for today's story, the Vikings are very much the bad guys. The goodies then? The Anglo-Saxons. But who the hell are they? In truth, they were not so different to the Vikings. They came from similar places, took to the sea, and in a search for land, riches, and glory, they invaded Britain, just a few hundred years earlier in the 400s. The leaders of these Saxon invasions gained a semi-divine status, and in doing so, have created a situation where a present member of the British royal family is related to a Saxon god. Stay tuned to find out who. Speaking of gods, these Angles and Saxons were Germanic people who believed in a very similar pantheon of gods to the Vikings. Instead of Thor, they had Thunor. Instead of Odin, Woden. And in place of Tyr, they had Tu. Double points if you can work out which days of the week they have lent their names to. The Angles and Saxons made Britain their home and pushed the native Britons to the curb. And by curb, I mean Wales.
Come in, Nessa, do you read me?
19 rubber duck. Oh, Bryn, I'm not gonna tell you again. You can't call me Nessa on the airwaves. You gotta use my handle.
What is that?
My code name, Robert Mugabe.
Sorry, Robert, I keep forgetting.
Together, they formed roughly 7 kingdoms, and everything was going swimmingly. They even ditched their old gods and converted to Christianity, making them a more civilized, peaceful bunch.
Something! Take the kids! That's yours tonight! You want it! You want it! Take it!
It was into this world that our hero was born. Alfred, a West Saxon and Prince of Wessex, a kingdom that existed in the southwest of England. The year was 847 AD. 2 years earlier, Paris had been sacked by everyone's favourite Viking heartthrob, Ragnar Lothbrok, and the Viking Age was well and truly popping off. Alfred was the youngest of 4 brothers, who much preferred reading poetry than chasing power in the royal court. When he was a boy, his mother issued him and his brothers with a challenge. She presented them with a book of Saxon poetry and told them, "Whichever of you shall the soonest learn this volume shall have it for his own." This was Alfred's kind of challenge, and a neat allegory for how he would eventually take the throne. One by one, his brothers inherited the kingdom of Wessex, and one by one, they died before their time. In 865, his brother Ethelred became king, the same year that the great heathen army, a huge force of Vikings known at the time as Danes, arrived in East Anglia. Anyone would say that the West Saxon throne was well and truly doomed, and what's worse is that this time the Vikings hadn't come to raid, they had come to conquer. By the year 868, East Anglia and Northumbria had both fallen to the heathens and their leader, Ivar the Boneless. One thing I love about this time period is that the Vikings would give their heroic characters such fantastic nicknames, making a historical story like this sound like I'm reading results from the last UFC event. But who was this Ivar character, and where were his bones? Well, we don't really know. Some people believe he was cursed, others that he suffered from an illness or a disease. He could have just been extraordinarily flexible and agile in combat. Or perhaps boneless is a bad translation of the Latin word for hated. Bones or no bones, what we can all agree on is that Ivar was a very scary dude. Alfred believed that this great heathen army was sent as a punishment from God, and he was about to learn firsthand just how punishing it was to fight against the Danes. In 870, Alfred and Ethelred rode at the head of a West Saxon army to help liberate neighbours Mercia from Ivar's army. The two armies clashed in the field, fighting several battles over the next few months, all with a very similar result: defeat for Alfred. In 871, things got even worse. Alfred's brother, the king, Ethelred, died, probably succumbing to injuries that he'd sustained in combat. Alfred, around 21 years old, was now king of the embattled Wessex. Not willing to continue what was becoming quite the losing streak, Alfred paid off the Danes, and bought himself what would amount to a few years of relative peace. It was around this time that Alfred started suffering from a mysterious illness, no doubt brought on by the stress of watching his house and kingdom fall into darkness. Historians believe that this could have been Crohn's disease or colitis, leaving Alfred in crippling discomfort for long periods of time and undoubtedly affecting his ability to present himself as a warrior king. Alfred was playing life on hard mode. A devoted scholar of Christian theology, he must have been sure that God was testing him. Failure looked more than likely. The year was now 878, and another horde of Danes known as the Great Summer Army had mercilessly murked Mercia. From among them, a new final boss had emerged. His name was Guthrum.
Only Guthrum can save you. Guthrum is your god now.
I'm no historian, but if I had to guess, he probably had a beard and smelled like a wet dog. The fate of Alfred's kingdom, his culture and people was balanced on a knife edge. The brave West Saxons had dug in and held Guthrum's advances, but not for long. Totally overrun, the West Saxon forces were crushed in battle and scattered among the green hills, forests, and marshes of Wessex. Alfred barely escaped with his life. He retreated into the marshes of Somerset, an area so misty, wet, and impassable that the invaders were hesitant to give pursuit. It is said that Alfred took refuge there with the people of the marshes, a king amongst swineherds. The story goes that a peasant woman tasked the miserable-looking warrior to watch over her baking cakes in return for shelter. Deep in his own thoughts, Alfred let the cakes burn and took yet another beating at the hands of a peasant woman.
Man, lift that lid off, it looks black.
It is black.
God!
Both of them.
Sick! Sick! It's black!
Yes, Chef.
Oh my God!
Alfred had taken a lifetime of losses in a few short years. His forces were broken, his kingdom was in the grubby hands of Guthrum. To say anything about his reign was great at this point would be nothing less than sarcastic. But what the world didn't know about Alfred was that he was totally unbreakable. He knew that if he bided his time, prayed, regrouped, and refocused, he could make the best comeback since the mullet. Probably whilst licking toads out of sheer boredom hiding in the marsh, Alfred had a series of mystical experiences. He saw the visions of the saints in the mist. They told him to have faith, to take the fight to the heathen Danes. He saw himself, too, standing as a warrior of legend, King Arthur-like, Excalibur at his side, driving the Vikings back into the sea. Alfred began to wage a guerrilla war against the Danes, and with some success.
Do you hear that? Why are the trees speaking Old English?
His hit-and-run tactics coaxed loyal Saxons out of hiding and slowly into his growing army. Alfred's force took to the field. They were unhorsed, unwashed, but armed with fresh steel. Guthrum's Danes quickly heard that the sickly, god-bothering nerd Alfred had returned and met him at the Battle of Edington. A grinding, ruthless melee that would become one of the most important battles in English history.
For Christ, for Wessex, and for England!
Alfred's biographer Asser wrote this about the battle, using pagans to describe Guthrum's army. Fighting ferociously, forming a dense shield wall against the whole army of the pagans, and striving long and bravely. At last, Alfred gained the victory. He overthrew the pagans with great slaughter, and smiting the fugitives, he pursued them as far as the fortress. Against all odds, Alfred had triumphed in battle against the Danes. He quickly besieged the Viking fortress, and within a fortnight he had starved them into diplomacy. Guthrum surrendered his army and his mortal soul as he was baptized with Alfred as sponsor. Now this is the early medieval version of teabagging or a fortnight emote. The Danes were banished back into the northeast of the country, an area they called the Danelaw, with York, or Jorvik, as its capital. Guthrum remained the king of this Viking state until his death in 890, ruling under the much less menacing name Ethelstan. Alfred was a scholar, and learning from his mistakes was second nature to him. He had almost lost his kingdom once, but never again. Wessex absorbed Mercia through a marriage alliance between their king and Alfred's daughter. He also reclaimed London from the Danes, which made him the king of the Anglo-Saxons as a whole, and not just Wessex. He then created the first Anglo-Saxon standing army and navy to help counter future raids. To protect his people, who were no doubt scarred by the Norse terror they had been victim to for decades, he refurbished forts all over the land. These forts were sometimes the ancient hill forts of the Britons, or sites of Roman fortification from hundreds of years earlier. Either way, almost every major settlement was now a day's ride from walls or soldiers. These forts were known as burhs, and they still exist in the names of British places to this day. Edinburgh, Peterborough and Shrewsbury, for example, all contain burh as a suffix in their name. At heart, Alfred's theory on the Viking invasions was that they had come out of a negligence for education and learning from the Anglo-Saxon people. Now less threatened by the Vikings, Alfred wanted to make sure the people of his new kingdom had access to the best scholars and teachers. But this wouldn't be easy. Many of the country's best monks had been minced in the struggles against the Vikings. To compensate, he invited monks and teachers from all around the world to join his court, including his biographer, Asa. It is because of Asa and Alfred's love of learning that we know so much about the man behind the historical figure. Alfred is recorded as saying, "As often as you can, free yourself from worldly affairs, so that you may apply that wisdom which God gave you wherever you can. Remember what punishment befell us in this world when we ourselves didn't cherish learning nor transmit it to other men." He strongly encouraged his court to become literate in both Latin and Old English, and used his knowledge of the former to translate the great works of the time into the common tongue, so that anyone could access this knowledge that was previously reserved for those who had the means to make pilgrimages to Rome. He also oversaw the creation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was a historical record that stretched back to Roman Britain and was updated all the way beyond the Norman conquest in 1066. It serves as a fantastic primary historical resource to this day. Alfred died at around 50 years old in the year 899, finally succumbing to the illnesses that had harassed him for the last 30 years of his life. He wouldn't be known as the Great during his lifetime, but many years later, in a celebration for his great deeds and noble life. And it's no surprise that Alfred was remembered in this way. After all, being a scholar, he made the point to write all of this down. This probably plays a part in his almost spotless historical reputation, but that's easy to forgive when you consider that Alfred's actions in life and the recordings that were kept long after his death chased away the final shadows of the Dark Ages and pushed the first iterations of a united England into the light. He was succeeded by his son Edward the Elder, and the whole of England was united under the House of Wessex during the rule of his grandson, Athelstan. So to answer my question from the start of the video, which member of the British royal family is related to a Saxon god? Well, the roots of the House of Wessex run deep. Its founder, Cerdic, was said to have descended from Woden himself. Given that the West Saxon bloodline still runs through the British royal family to this day, that means that Charles III and his late mother, Queen Elizabeth II, are both related to the Saxon gods. I wonder how that affects their stance as the head of the Church of England, but that's a video for another day. Thank you for watching this video on Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. I hope that his tale can inspire those of you who are struggling against your own Vikings, real or imaginary. Remember that with enough courage and wisdom, even the most unlikely among us can become a true hero. Drop us a like if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment on which human influencer you'd like to see next, and don't forget to subscribe for more content.